Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. This video was made for entertainment purposes and is transformative in nature. Welcome, family, to Black World TV. Black by popular demand. Today's video is about Oregon, Portland, Oregon, who have created a law to decriminalize all drugs that goes into effect offering addicts rehab instead of prison. So for Janie Gullickson, rock bottom came both slowly and all at once. A long-time drug and alcohol addict, Gullickson pushes back on the idea that one terrible day on the street leads to an epiphany and a climb back to normalcy. That's what happens in movies, not real life. Quote, "I lived in the bottom for years," says Gullickson, 52. "For me and people like me, I laid there and wallowed in it for a long time," unquote. Well, sidebar, we saw that when we witnessed all of those drug addicts on opioids falling out on the sidewalk, on the streets, in their cars, right in front of their children, I might add. But that's another story. But if she has to pick the lowest point, one that lasted years, not days, she says, it came shortly after she hit 30 in 1998. At that time, Gullickson had 5 kids, ages 5 to 11, by 4 different men. Talk about having some baby daddies. See, they always reserve that word or that term for black women, but white women have baby daddies too. Case in point, this woman, Janie Gullickson, as I just read to you, she had 5 kids, ages 5 to 11, by 4 different men. She got baby daddies. But I digress. She came home from work one day as a locksmith to find that her ex-husband had taken her 2 youngest and left the state. Horrified, devastated, and convinced that this was the beginning of the end, her life spiraled. She dropped her other son off with his dad, left her 2 daughters with her mom, and soon became an IV meth user. In prison 6 years later, Gullickson was contemplating joining an intensive recovery program when a striking, and this is how they put it, family, when a striking, magnetic, gorgeous black woman walked in the room, held up a mugshot, and started talking about being in the very chairs where we were sitting. Gullickson remembers. "There was life on the other side of addiction and prison," the woman said, "but you have to fight for it." Gullickson believed her. Quote, "I remember thinking I may not be able to do all that, be what she was, but maybe I could do something different than this," Gullickson said. "That day I felt the door open to change and healing." Now, Gullickson, executive director of the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon, did you check that? Now, after she's been in prison and on drugs, they give her a job as an executive director of the Mental Health and Addiction Association of Oregon. Okay, is determined to give other addicts the same opportunity. That's why she pushed for the passage of Measure 110, first of its kind legislation that decriminalizes the possession of all illegal drugs in Oregon, including heroin, cocaine, meth, and oxycodone. Instead of a criminal justice-based approach, the state will pivot to a healthcare-based approach, offering addicts treatment instead of prison time. Those in possession will be fined $100, a citation that will be dropped if they agree to health assessment. Now, I'm going to pause for a second and just say that you have over 1 million or so black people and brown people as well in the jails and prison for drug possession. And we have to witness in 2021 how this government under Jim Crow Biden and Kamala Harris, who both enjoy putting black people in prisons and in the jails, we have to now witness them do an about face and give mostly white folks, mind you, a slap on the wrist with $100 fine and a citation that will be dropped, mind you, if they agree to a health assessment. This is what we have to witness today. This is the reason why black media, the new black media in particular, why we point out these very, very racist, hardcore tactics used by this government against its black American citizens, against its brown American citizens. But I'm speaking primarily for black people. But this is what we have to witness all the time, where we are the brunt of their issues all the time, where they make an example out of us, out of black people, but they get a slap on the wrist and they get to go to rehab. They get a fine and a citation that gets dropped. So let me just say this before I move on. This is the reason why I have no love or no pity or feel sorry for nothing for any of these drug dealers who happen to be white. I have no feelings whatsoever. Why? Because you had none for black people when we were going through a crack epidemic. You had absolutely no concern whatsoever because, see, we didn't get chances like citations or drug rehabs. Nope, they simply locked us up. They took us to jail and locked our behinds up. And they gave us years and years and years in the prisons and jails behind these things. But yet now they want to give white people, because you guys are the brunt of heroin, you guys are the main users of cocaine, and you're the main users of meth. And we know this. And you can't change those facts. We know that. But see, you get a slap on the wrist. But I digress. So the law goes into effect Monday and will be implemented over the next decade by the state officials at the Oregon Health Authority. Advocates say the pivot will be life-changing for thousands of Oregonians. Quote, one of the things people misunderstand is how criminalization creates barriers to treatment, says Cassandra Frederick, the executive director of the Drug Policy Alliance, a national nonprofit dedicated to legalizing illicit drug use. Quote, if we want people to make different choices, we have to give them more options. Ending criminalization will do leaps and bounds around ending shame, which automatically opens people up for other opportunities, unquote. Now, let me pause again. Why didn't you guys come up with these solutions towards black Americans when we were going through the crack epidemic? Question mark. Why didn't you come up with these solutions like rehab for black people when we were going through the crack epidemic? Why didn't you do that? Instead, you chose to lock us up like animals. You're pathetic. Your system is pathetic. It's evil and rotten to the core. I've mentioned this in several of my other videos. I don't care if you don't like it. I'm speaking the truth. Period. Point blank. But I digress. So, nationally, others are hopeful this could be the first move, be the first in a wave of progressive measures that undo years of damage caused by drug criminalization, which disproportionately imprisoned black people and other people of color across the U.S. Quote, I hope that we all become more enlightened across this country that substance abuse is not something that necessitates incarceration. Wow, these people are just too freaking amazing. But anyways, it says but speaks to other social ills, lack of health care, lack of treatment, things of that nature, says Rep. Bonnie Watson Coleman, a Democrat of New Jersey, an outspoken critic of the war on drugs. Quote, if you're white and wealthy, you get an opportunity to get a break, go home to your family, and go into some kind of healthcare environment. Unquote. But it's often different for black people and other people of color, Watson Coleman says. According to the Drug Policy Alliance, prosecutors are twice as likely to pursue a mandatory minimum sentence for black people as for white people charged with the same offense. And many black people do time for possession alone. Listen to this. In 2016, there were more than 1.5 million drug arrests. More than 80% were for possession only. That's pathetic. Watson Coleman also points out that it's far more expensive to pay to incarcerate someone than get them treatment. You think we black people have been saying this for the longest, but this society, this rotten to the core system, our claims have fallen on deaf ears, and now all of a sudden you have a ray of sunshine that just opened up your eyes miraculously because it's not dealing with black people. But anyways, rehab programs not only empower people, she says, but they also save communities money. In early 2020, the Oregon Health Authority announced a 10-year plan to limit health inequities across the state. Measure 110 will be a crucial step in that fight, says Steve Allen, the behavioral health director at the authority OHA. Helping addicts fight addiction means more than just straight drug rehab, he says. Addiction is rarely an isolated event, as people struggling with it are typically juggling other crises including mental illness, physical or dental health care issues, and homelessness. Too many people spend too much of their lives cycling in and out of jails and emergency departments, Allen says, instead of getting the wraparound services they need. A move to take care of the whole individual will pay huge dividends. Quote, what we know is that punishment for addiction doesn't work and doesn't improve outcomes for people, Allen says. He points out that the law is going into effect at a critical time. Since the COVID-19 pandemic started in spring 2020, overdoses in Oregon have skyrocketed by 70%. The program will be paid for by redistributing existing marijuana dollars that come from the state's cannabis tax. Wow, which Allen calls a huge advantage because it likely won't be dependent on whims of the local economy. Marijuana funds have gone up recently, he noted. Gullickson, who has been sober since 2008 after a few detours, already sees a shift nationally in the conversation around addiction. She points to the October 2020 presidential debate when then Democratic nominee Jim Crow Joe Biden said, quote, no one should be going to jail because they have a drug problem, unquote. What a hypocrite. Jim Crow Joe Biden, you're such a hypocrite. You orchestrated the 3 strikes law with Bill Clinton, if I'm not mistaken. You supported that wholeheartedly, which put a lot of black people in the prisons and in the jails. And now you have an about face? Okay, so he says, and express support for drug diversion programs. Having Biden in the White House now, quote, makes a huge difference, Gullickson says. So Frederick at the Drug Policy Alliance agrees that and says the Biden administration's promise to bring science back to the White House will play an important role going forward. Quote, we need to ground our policies in science instead of stigma and punishment, Frederick says. In 2018, as the House studied and voted on bills aimed at helping solve America's opioid crisis, Watson Coleman introduced her own legislation that called for Congress to formally apologize for the war on drugs and acknowledge the damage it had done to black communities and other communities of color. It also called for future drug policy to be grounded in evidence-based healthcare solutions. The war on drugs, Watson Coleman says, was used as a weapon, as a tool to disrupt our communities, and we're talking about black communities in particular. Particularly during the Richard Nixon era, it was a disguise to break up and weaken black communities. It wasn't a war on drugs, it was a war on poor black men and women and brown men and women, and it did terrible things to families for generations. But she's optimistic. Change is coming. So is Gullickson, who's committed to helping in any and every way she can. But anyway, she believes legislation like Measure 110 will create an environment where instead of being somewhere accidentally and hoping someone will walk in and give you hope, we're doing that proactively. She knows it'll take time to fully implement and there will be issues along the way. She also knows if it works, it could be implemented in other places, and millions of other people like her who once felt hopeless, alone, and isolated could find something else, something good to live for. Quote, if we do this right in Oregon, I think there's a will to do it everywhere, she says. We've got a huge responsibility to show that this is the right thing and it can work. Well, that sounds good and dandy, Miss Gullickson, and I'm so happy that you've been given the privilege to be placed in a position as a director at a mental health institute. You're so privileged. I'm so glad our government and the state gave you that opportunity, but will you ask them why they haven't done the same thing to black Americans? Can you please do that, Miss Gullickson? And if you're really truly concerned, and if you're really truthful about what you put out there, and especially in this article, because you guys sure sugarcoat a lot of stuff. If you're really true and factual about it, then when are you going to start letting those black men and women, as well as the brown men and women, and when are you going to start letting them get out of the jails and prisons? You see, we're dealing with something way more sinister here, and it's called racism, and it has to do with anti-black racism in particular. So this article that kept saying people of color, you notice that I kept saying black communities? Yeah, that came out of my mouth because I wasn't going to read the words that was coming out of this media article here. I wasn't going to do that because I'm putting the facts out there. And the facts are that it's affected black communities way more than anyone else. So I ask again, Miss Gullickson and Jim Crow Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, when are you going to start letting black men and women out of these jails and prisons that are in there for drug possession? When is it going to happen? With this Measure 110, it should start happening sooner than later. This is Black World TV, black by popular demand. We'll see you in the next video.